بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم باب ما جاء في ترجل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The chapter that has come regarding the combing of the hair of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhanallah, this was the depth of the perception of the Sahaba. Not only did they worry about how his hair was, but then they go into how did he comb his hair. And so here's the first hadith in Aisha radiallahu anha قالت كنت أرجل رأس رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأنا حائض. Aisha radiallahu anha, the mother of the mu'mineen and the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, says, كنت أرجل, I used to comb رأس رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, the head of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وأنا حائض, in that state when I was actually in the state of haid. So this highlights a couple things. First is that it's mustahab to comb the hair. The question should arise, right? Should we comb our hair or should we not comb our hair? Should we just leave it and be natural? But the Prophet ﷺ actually did comb his hair. At the same time, the Prophet ﷺ warned us about being too obsessive with combing our hair. So it's mustahab to comb the hair, but it's also encouraged to not overdo it. And Aisha radiallahu anha relates that she used to comb the hair, so that's the first proof that hair can be combed. And the second is that she was in a state of haid. So it shows that haid is a state, it's an internal state. It doesn't actually come into the organs as well. I mean, if a woman is in a state of haid, it's not that her hand is also impure and her feet are also impure. It's an internal state of impurity. And so she was able to touch the Prophet ﷺ and not have to worry about being in the state of haid. So it's a second issue that's established by this particular hadith. And Anas ibn Malik قال, related by Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يكثر الدهن رأسه. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to abundantly place oil in his head, in his hair. وتسريح لحيته, and he used to comb his beard abundantly. وَيُكْثِرُ الْقِنَاعَ, and he used to be regular in wearing a cloth over his head. حَتَّى كَأَنَّ ثَوْبَهُ ثَوْبُ زَيَّاتٍ, such that the cloth that he used to wear on his head became like an oily piece of cloth. So a few sunan are established in this particular hadith. Number one is that the Prophet ﷺ used to put oil in his hair. And this is a very regular and continuous sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. He used to do it regularly. So he would put oil in his hair, and then after he would put oil in his hair, he would put a cloth on top of his head. And he often wore this cloth. And that cloth, the Prophet ﷺ used to be so excessive in the oil that he used to put that the cloth used to pick up some of that oil as well. And so the cloth became this oily cloth. And so that's what this particular companion is saying. Two things. One, that the oil was put in the head, and two, the Prophet ﷺ used to keep his head covered with a cloth. Now sometimes that cloth would be the only thing he would wear, other times that cloth would be the cloth upon which he would tie his turban. So it was regular for him to cover his head with a cloth. And he used to comb his beard regularly. So this actually hints at the length of the beard as well. So the Prophet ﷺ used to comb it regularly, meaning it was long enough to be combed. And Aisha radiallahu anha قالت إن كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحب التيمم في طهوره إذا تطهر وفي ترجله إذا ترجل وفي انتعاله إذا انتعل. So Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to love the right side in his purification. So when the Prophet ﷺ used to make wudu, he used to start with the right side. When he washed his hands, he started with the right. When he washed his feet, he started with the right. وَفِي تَرَجُّلِهِ, and in his combing of his hair. وَفِي انْتِعَالِ إِذَا انْتَعَلَ, and in wearing his shoes whenever he put them on. So this hadith lists 3 acts that the Prophet ﷺ did with preference to the right. And actually this hadith only lists 3 acts, but includes several other acts as well. Any act that the Prophet ﷺ did, most of the acts that the Prophet ﷺ did, he often started with the right side. So we should keep that in mind. And when taking things off, the Prophet ﷺ would, especially in clothing, would start on the left side. So if the Prophet ﷺ was putting shoes on, he would put the right side on, then the left side. When he's putting a shirt on, he would put the right hand in the sleeve, then the left hand. If you're putting your pants on, then you put your right foot in first, then the left. But when you're removing, it's opposite. When you're removing your shirt, it's the left hand first. When you're removing your shoe, it's the left foot first, etc. So this is a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And it just shows you that even in the smallest aspects of your life, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ continuously applies. I mean, when the Prophet ﷺ does this, he's not doing it because it was just his personal habit. He's doing it conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we should be very careful, even in the smallest of deeds, to try to be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وعن عبد الله ibn مغفل قال نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الترجل إلا غبا. So Abdullah ibn Mughaffal says that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited us from combing our hairs illa ghibba, except at intervals. So again, you got to put all the hadith together to come up with the idea that it's sunnah to comb, it's mustahab to comb the hair, but not excessively. And so these balance out. Meaning, you do it when it's necessary. عن رجل من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن النبي كان يترجل غبا. That the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يترجل غبا. He used to comb his hair at intervals on occasion. Now this hadith is actually, we've already explained this idea of combing the hair, but this hadith has something different than any of the previous hadith which we've covered. And that is that look at the chain of narrators. أَنْ رَجُلٍ مِّنْ أَصْحَابِ النَّبِيِّ. This was related by an unknown companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, there is a principle within hadith sciences that if a hadith is narrated, you have to know who the narrator is, otherwise it's weak. You can't just say someone told me, you have to say who the person is. Why? Because when you say who the person is, then the muhaddithin can ascertain, was that person a liar? Was that person a sinner? Was that person a fasiq? Etc. How righteous was that person? What were the physical characteristics of that person? They examine that person from head to toe, and then they make a judgment about the narrator, and they say, yes, he is one of the narrators that will allow a hadith to be classified as sahih. Or no, he had a bad memory. Or no, he left the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in certain instances. Or no, etc., etc., etc. So you have to know who the name of the person is in the chain of narrators in order to accept or reject the hadith. Because that's the only way you can judge whether the narration is true or false. Except in the case of the Sahaba. Only exception to this rule is when you have a Sahaba narrating. Why? Because all of the Sahaba are truthful. And all of them were on the Sunnah. كُلُّهُمْ عَدُولٌ. There's a principle within hadith sciences that once the name of the Sahaba comes in the hadith, that part of the hadith is automatically perfect. And so this highlights the status of the Sahaba. فَإِنْ آمَنُوا بِمِثْلِ آمَنْتُمْ بِهِ فَقَدْ اهْتَدَوْا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself says, and if you believe that the way they believe, then verily you will be guided. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes the Sahaba the criterion of Iman in this particular ayah. Similarly, in another ayah, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمْ آمِنُوا كَمَا آمَنَ النَّاسِ. And when it is said to them, to the kuffar, believe as the people have believed, they say, and then they make their statement rejecting belief. But the point is that in this particular ayah, look at the da'wah. When it's said to them, believe as the people believe. Not believe as the Quran tells you to believe. Not believe as the Prophet ﷺ tells you to believe. Believe as all these Sahaba have believed. Then they say, and they make an excuse. So the Sahaba themselves were made the criterion of Iman by the Quran. Then in another ayah, رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them and they're pleased with Him. So they have a very, very high status within the tradition. And once the name of a Sahaba comes in hadith, it's automatically, that portion of the hadith, that link of the hadith is 100%. So that's why it's acceptable to say, أَنْ رَجُلٍ مِّنْ أَصْحَابٍ, from a man from among the Sahaba. Because all of the Sahaba, كُلُّهُمْ عَدُولٌ, all of them are righteous. They're all just. So this is a very important principle. Now, there are certain instances when you read a hadith or you read a narration in which a question arises in your mind about a particular companion. For example, you read the narrations about the time after the death of the Prophet ﷺ when certain fitnas arose within Mecca or Medina. Now, on those instances, we have no right to criticize a single Sahaba. We just don't. Because the Prophet ﷺ has said he's pleased with them. That's it. It's over. It's a done deal. We have no right. That's nas. That's qat'i. It's 100% certain that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them. So we cannot criticize them at that point. So when you read these historical narrations that such and such happened, you have to always be able to explain it away. When the Sahaba came into the point where they were actually on the battlefield against one another, it was because of the fact that they acted upon what they believed to be true. Both sides were right. In the battles that occurred between the Sahaba, both sides were right. It was just a question of ijtihad. And each of them it was a requirement of their being a Sahaba that if they believed something to be true, that they stood up for it, because otherwise all of their narrations and everything that we took from them would mean nothing if they weren't willing to stand up for what was true. So when we see that the Sahaba had conflicts, it was with the best of intentions, and they were ijtihadi differences. There were acceptable differences within the Sharia. It's just that they stood very firm on what they thought. And so that's the beauty of the Sahaba. That's why they became the Sahaba. That's why Allah chose them to sit with the Prophet ﷺ every single day, in and day out. So keep that in mind when you read this particular narration.